Chapter 33. It was, as Mrs. Archer smilingly said to Mrs. Welland, a great event for a young couple to give their first big dinner. The Newland Archers, since they had set up their household, had received a good deal of company in an informal way. Archer was fond of having 3 or 4 friends to dine, and May welcomed them with the beaming readiness of which her mother had set her the example in conjugal affairs. Her husband questioned whether, if left to herself, she would ever have asked anyone to the house, but he had long given up trying to disengage her real self from the shape into which tradition and training had molded her. It was expected that well-off young couples in New York should do a good deal of informal entertaining, and a Welland married to an Archer was doubly pledged to the tradition. But a big dinner, with a hired chef and 2 borrowed footmen, with Roman punch, roses from Henderson's, and menus on gilt-edged cards, was a different affair, and not to be lightly undertaken. As Mrs. Archer remarked, the Roman punch made all the difference, not in itself but by its manifold implications, since it signified either canvasbacks or terrapin, 2 soups, a hot and a cold sweet, full décolletage with short sleeves, and guests of a proportionate importance. It was always an interesting occasion when a young pair launched their first invitations in the third person, and their summons was seldom refused even by the seasoned and sought after. Still, it was admittedly a triumph that the van der Luydens, at May's request, should have stayed over in order to be present at her farewell dinner for the Countess Olenska. The 2 mothers-in-law sat in May's drawing room on the afternoon of the great day, Mrs. Archer writing out the menus on Tiffany's thickest gilt-edged Bristol, while Mrs. Welland superintended the placing of the palms and standard lamps. Archer, arriving late from his office, found them still there. Mrs. Archer had turned her attention to the name cards for the table, and Mrs. Welland was considering the effect of bringing forward the large gilt sofa so that another corner might be created between the piano and the window. May, they told him, was in the dining room inspecting the mound of Jacqueminot roses and maidenhair in the center of the long table, and the placing of the Maillard bonbons in open-work silver baskets between the candelabra. On the piano stood a large basket of orchids which Mr. van der Luyden had sent from Skuytercliff. Everything was, in short, as it should be on the approach of so considerable an event. Mrs. Archer ran thoughtfully over the list, checking off each name with her sharp gold pen. Henry van der Luyden, Louisa, the Lovell Mingots, the Reggie Chiverses, Lawrence Lefferts, and Gertrude. Yes, I suppose May was right to have them. The Selfridge Marys, Sillerton Jackson, Van Newland and his wife. How time passes. It seems only yesterday that he was your best man, Newland. And Countess Olenska. Yes, I think that's all. Mrs. Welland surveyed her son-in-law affectionately. No one can say, Newland, that you and May are not giving Ellen a handsome send-off. Ah, well, said Mrs. Archer, I understand May's wanting her cousin to tell people abroad that we're not quite barbarians. I'm sure Ellen will appreciate it. She was to arrive this morning, I believe. It will make a most charming last impression. The evening before sailing is usually so dreary, Mrs. Welland cheerfully continued. Archer turned toward the door, and his mother-in-law called to him, Do go in and have a peep at the table, and don't let May tire herself too much. But he affected not to hear, and sprang up the stairs to his library. The room looked at him like an alien countenance composed into a polite grimace, and he perceived that it had been ruthlessly tidied and prepared by a judicious distribution of ashtrays in cedarwood boxes for the gentlemen to smoke in. Ah, well, he thought, it's not for long, and he went on to his dressing room. 10 days had passed since Madame Olenska's departure from New York. During those 10 days, Archer had had no sign from her, but that conveyed by the return of a key wrapped in tissue paper and sent to his office in a sealed envelope addressed in her hand. This retort to his last appeal might have been interpreted as a classic move in a familiar game, but the young man chose to give it a different meaning. She was still fighting against her fate, but she was going to Europe, and she was not returning to her husband. Nothing, therefore, was to prevent his following her, and once he had taken the irrevocable step and had proved to her that it was irrevocable, he believed she would not send him away. This confidence in the future had steadied him to play his part in the present. It had kept him from writing to her or betraying by any sign or act his misery and mortification. It seemed to him that in the deadly silent game between them, the trumps were still in his hands, and he waited. There had been, nevertheless, moments sufficiently difficult to pass, as when Mr. Letterblair, the day after Madame Olenska's departure, had sent for him to go over the details of the trust which Mrs. Manson Mingot wished to create for her granddaughter. For a couple of hours, Archer had examined the terms of the deed with his senior, all the while obscurely feeling that, if he had been consulted, it was for some reason other than the obvious one of his cousinship, and that the close of the conference would reveal it. "Well, the lady can't deny that it's a handsome arrangement," Mr. Letterblair had summed up, after mumbling over a summary of the settlement. "In fact, I'm bound to say she's been treated pretty handsomely all round." "All round?" Archer echoed with a touch of derision. "Do you refer to her husband's proposal to give her back her own money?" Mr. Letterblair's bushy eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch. "My dear sir, the law's the law, and your wife's cousin was married under the French law. It's to be presumed she knew what that meant." "Even if she did, what happened subsequently?" But Archer paused. Mr. Letterblair had laid his pen handle against his big corrugated nose, and was looking down it with the expression assumed by virtuous elderly gentlemen when they wish their youngers to understand that virtue is not synonymous with ignorance. "My dear sir, I've no wish to extenuate the Count's transgressions, but on the other side, I wouldn't put my hand in the fire, well, that there hadn't been tit for tat with the young champion." Mr. Letterblair unlocked a drawer and pushed a folded paper toward Archer. "This report, the result of discreet inquiries." And then, as Archer made no effort to glance at the paper or to repudiate the suggestion, the lawyer somewhat flatly continued, "I don't say it's conclusive, you observe. Far from it, but straws show, and on the whole it's eminently satisfactory for all parties that this dignified solution has been reached." "Oh, eminently," Archer assented, pushing back the paper. A day or two later, on responding to a summons from Mrs. Manson Mingot, his soul had been more deeply tried. He had found the old lady depressed and querulous. "You know she's deserted me," she began at once, and without waiting for his reply, "Oh, don't ask me why. She gave so many reasons that I've forgotten them all. My private belief is that she couldn't face the boredom. At any rate, that's what Augusta and my daughters-in-law think, and I don't know that I altogether blame her. Olenski's a finished scoundrel, but life with him must have been a good deal gayer than it is in Fifth Avenue. Not that the family would admit that. They think Fifth Avenue is heaven with the Rue de la Paix thrown in, and poor Ellen, of course, has no idea of going back to her husband. She held out as firmly as ever against that. So she's to settle down in Paris with that fool Medora. Well, Paris is Paris, and you can keep a carriage there on next to nothing. But she was as gay as a bird, and I shall miss her." 2 tears, the parched tears of the old, rolled down her puffy cheeks and vanished in the abysses of her bosom. "All I ask is," she concluded, "that they shouldn't bother me anymore. I must really be allowed to digest my gruel." And she twinkled a little wistfully at Archer. It was that evening, on his return home, that May announced her intention of giving a farewell dinner to her cousin. Madame Olenska's name had not been pronounced between them since the night of her flight to Washington, and Archer looked at his wife with surprise. "A dinner? Why?" he interrogated. Her color rose. "But you like Ellen? I thought you'd be pleased." "It's awfully nice. You're putting it in that way. But I really don't see—" "I mean to do it, Newland," she said, quietly rising and going to her desk. "Here are the invitations all written. Mother helped me. She agrees that we ought to." She paused, embarrassed and yet smiling, and Archer suddenly saw before him the embodied image of the family. "Oh, all right," he said, staring with unseeing ease at the list of guests that she had put in his hand. When he entered the drawing room before dinner, May was stooping over the fire and trying to coax the logs to burn in their unaccustomed setting of immaculate tiles. The tall lamps were all lit, and Mr. von der Luyden's orchids had been conspicuously disposed in various receptacles of modern porcelain and knobby silver. Mrs. Newland Archer's drawing room was generally thought a great success. A gilt bamboo jardiniere, in which the primulas and cinerarias were punctually renewed, blocked the access to the bay window, where the old-fashioned would have preferred a bronze reduction of the Venus of Milo. The sofas and armchairs of pale brocade were cleverly grouped about little plush tables, densely covered with silver toys, porcelain animals and efflorescent photograph frames, and tall, rosy-shaded lamps shot up like tropical flowers among the palms. "I don't think Ellen has ever seen this room lighted up," said May, rising flushed from her struggle, and sending about her a glance of pardonable pride. The brass tongs, which she had propped against the side of the chimney, fell with a crash that drowned her husband's answer. And before he could restore them, Mr. and Mrs. von der Luyden were announced. The other guests quickly followed, for it was known that the van der Luydens liked to dine punctually. The room was nearly full, and Archer was engaged in showing to Mrs. Selfridge Mary a small, highly varnished Verbeckhoven study of sheep, which Mr. Welland had given May for Christmas, when he found Madame Olenska at his side. She was excessively pale, and her pallor made her dark hair seem denser and heavier than ever. Perhaps that, or the fact that she had wound several rows of amber beads about her neck, reminded him suddenly of the little Ellen Mingot he had danced with at children's parties when Medora Manson had first brought her to New York. The amber beads were trying to her complexion, or her dress was perhaps unbecoming. Her face looked lusterless and almost ugly, and he had never loved it as he did at that minute. Their hands met, and he thought he heard her say, "Yes, we're sailing tomorrow in the Russia." Then there was an unmeaning noise of opening doors, and after an interval, May's voice, "Newland, dinner's been announced. Won't you please take Ellen in?" Madame Olenska put her hand on his arm, and he noticed that the hand was ungloved, and remembered how he had kept his eyes fixed on it the evening that he had sat with her in the little 23rd Street drawing room. All the beauty that had forsaken her face seemed to have taken refuge in the long, pale fingers and faintly dimpled knuckles on his sleeve, and he said to himself, "If it were only to see her hand again, I should have to follow her." It was only at an entertainment ostensibly offered to a foreign visitor that Mrs. van der Luyden could suffer the diminution of being placed on her host's left. The fact of Madame Olenska's foreignness could hardly have been more adroitly emphasized than by this farewell tribute, and Mrs. von der Luyden accepted her displacement with an affability which left no doubt as to her approval. There were certain things that had to be done, and if done at all, done handsomely and thoroughly, and one of these in the old New York Code was the tribal rally around a kinswoman about to be eliminated from the tribe. There was nothing on earth that the Wellands and Mingots would not have done to proclaim their unalterable affection for the Countess Olenska, now that her passage for Europe was engaged. And Archer, at the head of his table, sat marveling at the silent, untiring activity with which her popularity had been retrieved, grievances against her silenced, her past countenanced, and her present irradiated by the family approval. Mrs. von der Luyden shone on her with the dim benevolence which was her nearest approach to cordiality, and Mr. van der Luyden, from his seat at May's right, cast down the table glances plainly intended to justify all the carnations he had sent from Skuytercliff. Sir Archer, who seemed to be assisting at the scene in a state of odd imponderability, as if he floated somewhere between chandelier and ceiling, wondered at nothing so much as his own share in the proceedings. As his glance traveled from one placid, well-fed face to another, he saw all the harmless-looking people engaged upon May's canvas backs as a band of dumb conspirators, and himself and the pale woman on his right as the center of their conspiracy. And then it came over him, in a vast flash made up of many broken gleams, that to all of them he and Madame Olenska were lovers. Lovers in the extreme sense peculiar to foreign vocabularies. He guessed himself to have been, for months, the center of countless silently observing eyes and patiently listening ears. He understood that, by means as yet unknown to him, the separation between himself and the partner of his guilt had been achieved, and that now the whole tribe had rallied about his wife on the tacit assumption that nobody knew anything, or had ever imagined anything, and that the occasion of the entertainment was simply May Archer's natural desire to take an affectionate leave of her friend and cousin. It was the old New York way of taking life without effusion of blood, the way of people who dreaded scandal more than disease, who placed decency above courage, and who considered that nothing was more ill-bred than scenes, except the behavior of those who gave rise to them. As these thoughts succeeded each other in his mind, Archer felt like a prisoner in the center of an armed camp. He looked about the table, and guessed at the inexorableness of his captors from the tone in which, over the asparagus from Florida, they were dealing with Beaufort and his wife. It's to show me, he thought, what would happen to me. And a deathly sense of the superiority of implication and analogy over direct action, and of silence over rash words, closed in on him like the doors of the family vault. He laughed and met Mrs. von der Luyden's startled eyes. "You think it laughable?" she said with a pinched smile. "Of course, poor Regina's idea of remaining in New York has its ridiculous side, I suppose," and Archer muttered, "Of course." At this point, he became conscious that Madame Olenska's other neighbor had been engaged for some time with the lady on his right. At the same moment, he saw that May, serenely enthroned between Mr. van der Luyden and Mr. Selfridge Merry, had cast a quick glance down the table. It was evident that the host and the lady on his right could not sit through the whole meal in silence. He turned to Madame Olenska, and her pale smile met him. "Oh, do let's see it through," it seemed to say. "Did you find the journey tiring?" he asked in a voice that surprised him by its naturalness, and she answered that, on the contrary, she had seldom traveled with fewer discomforts. "Except, the dreadful heat in the train," she added, and he remarked that she would not suffer from that particular hardship in the country she was going to. "I never," he declared with intensity, "was more nearly frozen than once in April, in the train between Calais and Paris." She said she did not wonder, but remarked that after all, one could always carry an extra rug, and that every form of travel had its hardships, to which he abruptly returned that he thought them all of no account compared with the blessedness of getting away. She changed color, and he added, his voice suddenly rising in pitch, "I mean to do a lot of traveling myself before long." A tremor crossed her face, and leaning over to Reggie Chivers, he cried out, "I say, Reggie, what do you say to a trip round the world? Now, next month, I mean. I'm game if you are." At which Mrs. Reggie piped up that she could not think of letting Reggie go till after the Martha Washington ball she was getting up for the blind asylum in Easter week, and her husband placidly observed that by that time he would have to be practicing for the international polo match. But Mr. Selfridge Merry had caught the phrase "round the world," and having once circled the globe in his steam yacht, he seized the opportunity to send down the table several striking items concerning the shallowness of the Mediterranean ports. Though after all, he added, it didn't matter, for when you'd seen Athens and Smyrna and Constantinople, what else was there? And Mrs. Merry said she could never be too grateful to Dr. Bencomb for having made them promise not to go to Naples on account of the fever. "But you must have 3 weeks to do India properly," her husband conceded, anxious to have it understood that he was no frivolous globetrotter. And at this point, the ladies went up to the drawing room. In the library, in spite of weightier presences, Lawrence Lefferts predominated. The talk, as usual, had veered around to the Beauforts, and even Mr. van der Luyden and Mr. Selfridge Merry, installed in the honorary armchairs tacitly reserved for them, paused to listen to the younger man's philippic. Never had Lefferts so abounded in the sentiments that adorn Christian manhood and exalt the sanctity of the home. Indignation lent him a scathing eloquence, and it was clear that if others had followed his example and acted as he talked, society would never have been weak enough to receive a foreign upstart like Beaufort. No, sir, not even if he'd married a van der Luyden or a Lanning instead of a Dallas. And what chance would there have been, Lefferts wrathfully questioned, of his marrying into such a family as the Dallases, if he had not already wormed his way into certain houses, as people like Mrs. Lemuel Struthers had managed to worm theirs in his wake? If society chose to open its doors to vulgar women, the harm was not great, though the gain was doubtful. But once it got in the way of tolerating men of obscure origin and tainted wealth, the end was total disintegration, and at no distant date. If things go on at this pace, Lefferts thundered, looking like a young prophet dressed by Poole, and who had not yet been stoned, we shall see our children fighting for invitations to swindlers' houses and marrying Beaufort's bastards. "Oh, I say, draw it mild," Reggie Chivers and young Newland protested, while Mr. Selfridge Merry looked genuinely alarmed, and an expression of pain and disgust settled on Mr. van der Luyden's sensitive face. "Has he got any?" cried Mr. Sillerton Jackson, pricking up his ears, and while Lefferts tried to turn the question with a laugh, the old gentleman twittered into Archer's ear. "Queer. Those fellows who are always wanting to set things right. The people who have the worst cooks are always telling you they're poisoned when they dine out. But I hear there are pressing reasons for our friend Lawrence's diatribe. Typewriter this time, I understand. The talk swept past Archer like some senseless river, running and running because it did not know enough to stop. He saw on the faces about him expressions of interest, amusement, and even mirth. He listened to the younger men's laughter and to the praise of the Archer Madeira, which Mr. van der Luyden and Mr. Merry were thoughtfully celebrating. Through it all, he was dimly aware of a general attitude of friendliness toward himself, as if the guard of the prisoner he felt himself to be were trying to soften his captivity, and the perception increased his passionate determination to be free. In the drawing room, where they presently joined the ladies, he met May's triumphant eyes and read in them the conviction that everything had gone off beautifully. She rose from Madame Olenska's side, and immediately Mrs. van der Luyden beckoned the latter to a seat on the gilt sofa where she throned. Mrs. Selfridge Merry bore across the room to join them, and it became clear to Archer that here also a conspiracy of rehabilitation and obliteration was going on. The silent organization which held his little world together was determined to put itself on record as never for a moment having questioned the propriety of Madame Olenska's conduct or the completeness of Archer's domestic felicity. All these amiable and inexorable persons were resolutely engaged in pretending to each other that they had never heard of, suspected, or even conceived possible the least hint to the contrary. And from this tissue of elaborate mutual dissimulation, Archer once more disengaged the fact that New York believed him to be Madame Olenska's lover. He caught the glitter of victory in his wife's eyes, and for the first time understood that she shared the belief. The discovery roused a laughter of inner devils that reverberated through all his efforts to discuss the Martha Washington ball with Mrs. Reggie Chivers and little Mrs. Newland. And so the evening swept on, running and running like a senseless river that did not know how to stop. At length he saw that Madame Olenska had risen and was saying goodbye. He understood that in a moment she would be gone, and tried to remember what he had said to her at dinner, but he could not recall a single word they had exchanged. She went up to May, the rest of the company making a circle about her as she advanced. The two young women clasped hands, then May bent forward and kissed her cousin. "Certainly our hostess is much the handsomer of the two," Archer heard Reggie Chivers say in an undertone to young Mrs. Newland, and he remembered Beaufort's coarse sneer at May's ineffectual beauty. A moment later he was in the hall, putting Madame Olenska's cloak about her shoulders. Through all his confusion of mind, he had held fast to the resolve to say nothing that might startle or disturb her. Convinced that no power could now turn him from his purpose, he had found strength to let events shape themselves as they would. But as he followed Madame Olenska into the hall, he thought with a sudden hunger of being for a moment alone with her at the door of her carriage. "Is your carriage here?" he asked, and at that moment Mrs. van der Luyden, who was being majestically inserted into her sables, said gently, "We are driving dear Ellen home." Archer's heart gave a jerk, and Madame Olenska, clasping her cloak and fan with one hand, held out the other to him. "Goodbye," she said. "Goodbye, but I shall see you soon in Paris," he answered aloud. It seemed to him that he had shouted it. "Oh," she murmured, "if you and May could come." Mr. van der Luyden advanced to give her his arm, and Archer turned to Mrs. van der Luyden. For a moment, in the billowy darkness inside the big landau, he caught the dim oval of a face, eyes shining steadily, and she was gone. As he went up the steps, he crossed Lawrence Lefferts coming down with his wife. Lefferts caught his host by the sleeve, drawing back to let Gertrude pass. "I say, old chap, do you mind just letting it be understood that I'm dining with you at the club tomorrow night? Thanks so much, you old brick. Good night." "It did go off beautifully, didn't it?" May questioned from the threshold of the library. Archer roused himself with a start. As soon as the last carriage had driven away, he had come up to the library and shut himself in, with the hope that his wife, who still lingered below, would go straight to her room. But there she stood, pale and drawn, yet radiating the factitious energy of one who has passed beyond fatigue. "May I come and talk it over?" she asked. "Of course, if you like. But you must be awfully sleepy." "No, I'm not sleepy. I should like to sit with you a little." "Very well," he said, pushing her chair near the fire. She sat down and he resumed his seat, but neither spoke for a long time. At length, Archer began abruptly. "Since you're not tired and want to talk, there's something I must tell you. I tried to the other night." She looked at him quickly. "Yes, dear." "Something about yourself?" "About myself. You say you're not tired. Well, I am. Horribly tired." In an instant, she was all tender anxiety. "Oh, I've seen it coming on, Newland. You've been so wickedly overworked." "Perhaps it's that. Anyhow, I want to make a break." "A break? To give up the law?" "To go away at any rate, at once, on a long trip, ever so far off, away from everything." He paused, conscious that he had failed in his attempt to speak with the indifference of a man who longs for a change and is yet too weary to welcome it. Do what he would, the chord of eagerness vibrated. "Away from everything?" he repeated. "Ever so far? Where, for instance?" she asked. "Oh, I don't know. India or Japan." She stood up, and as he sat with bent head, his chin propped on his hands, he felt her warmly and fragrantly hovering over him. "As far as that? But I'm afraid you can't, dear," she said in an unsteady voice. "Not unless you'll take me with you." And then, as he was silent, she went on, in tones so clear and evenly pitched that each separate syllable tapped like a little hammer on his brain. "That is, if the doctors will let me go, but I'm afraid they won't. For you see, Newland, I've been sure since this morning of something I've been so longing and hoping for." He looked up at her with a sick stare, and she sank down, all dew and roses, and hid her face against his knee. "Oh, my dear," he said, holding her to him, while his cold hand stroked her hair. There was a long pause, which the inner devils filled with strident laughter. Then May freed herself from his arms and stood up. "You didn't guess?" "Yes, no. That is, of course, I hoped." They looked at each other for an instant, and again fell silent. Then, turning his eyes from hers, he asked abruptly, "Have you told anyone else?" "Only Mama and your mother." She paused and then added hurriedly, the blood flushing up to her forehead. "That is, and Ellen. You know I told you we'd had a long talk one afternoon, and how dear she was to me." "Ah," said Archer, his heart stopping. He felt that his wife was watching him intently. "Did you mind my telling her first, Newland?" "Mind? Why should I?" He made a last effort to collect himself. "But that was a fortnight ago, wasn't it? I thought you said you weren't sure till today." Her color burned deeper, but she held his gaze. "No, I wasn't sure then, but I told her I was. And you see I was right," she exclaimed, her blue eyes wet with victory. Chapter 34. Newland Archer sat at the writing table in his library in East 39th Street. He had just got back from a big official reception for the inauguration of the new galleries at the Metropolitan Museum, and the spectacle of those great spaces crowded with the spoils of the ages, where the throng of fashion circulated through a series of scientifically catalogued treasures, had suddenly pressed on a rusted spring of memory. "Why, this used to be one of the old Cessnola rooms," he heard someone say. And instantly everything about him vanished, and he was sitting alone on a hard leather divan against a radiator, while a slight figure in a long sealskin cloak moved away down the meagerly fitted vista of the old museum. The vision had roused a host of other associations, and he sat looking with new eyes at the library, which for over 30 years had been the scene of his solitary musings and of all the family confabulations. It was the room in which most of the real things of his life had happened. There his wife, nearly 26 years ago, had broken to him with a blushing circumlocution that would have caused the young women of the new generation to smile. The news that she was to have a child, and there their eldest boy, Dallas, too delicate to be taken to church in midwinter, had been christened by their old friend the Bishop of New York, the ample, magnificent, irreplaceable bishop, so long the pride and ornament of his diocese. There Dallas had first staggered across the floor shouting, "Dad!" while May and the nurse laughed behind the door. There their second child, Mary, who was so like her mother, had announced her engagement to the dullest and most reliable of Reggie Chivers's many sons. And there Archer had kissed her through her wedding veil before they went down to the motor, which was to carry them to Grace Church. For in a world where all else had reeled on its foundations, the Grace Church wedding remained an unchanged institution. It was in the library that he and May had always discussed the future of the children, the studies of Dallas and his young brother Bill, Mary's incurable indifference to accomplishments and passion for sport and philanthropy, and the vague leanings toward art, which had finally landed the restless and curious Dallas in the office of a rising New York architect. The young men nowadays were emancipating themselves from the law and business and taking up all sorts of new things. If they were not absorbed in state politics or municipal reform, the chances were that they were going in for Central American archaeology, for architecture or landscape engineering, taking a keen and learned interest in the pre-revolutionary buildings of their own country, studying and adapting Georgian types, and protesting at the meaningless use of the word colonial. Nobody nowadays had colonial houses except the millionaire grocers of the suburbs. But above all, sometimes Archer put it above all, it was in that library that the governor of New York, coming down from Albany one evening to dine and spend the night, had turned to his host and said, banging his clenched fist on the table and gnashing his eyeglasses, "Hang the professional politician. You're the kind of man the country wants, Archer. If the stable's ever to be cleaned out, men like you have got to lend a hand in the cleaning." Men like you. How Archer had glowed at the phrase, how eagerly he had risen up at the call. It was an echo of Ned Winsett's old appeal to roll his sleeves up and get down into the muck, but spoken by a man who set the example of the gesture and whose summons to follow him was irresistible. Archer, as he looked back, was not sure that men like himself were what his country needed, at least in the active service to which Theodore Roosevelt had pointed. In fact, there was reason to think it did not, for after a year in the State Assembly, he had not been reelected, and had dropped back thankfully into obscure if useful municipal work, and from that again to the writing of occasional articles in one of the reforming weeklies that were trying to shake the country out of its apathy. It was little enough to look back on, but when he remembered to what the young men of his generation and his set had looked forward, the narrow groove of money-making, sport, and society to which their vision had been limited, even his small contribution to the new state of things seemed to count, as each brick counts in a well-built wall. He had done little in public life. He would always be by nature a contemplative and a dilettante, but he had had high things to contemplate, great things to delight in, and one great man's friendship to be his strength and pride. He had been, in short, what people were beginning to call a good citizen. In New York, for many years past, every new movement, philanthropic, municipal, or artistic, had taken account of his opinion and wanted his name. People said, "Ask Archer," when there was a question of starting the first school for crippled children, reorganizing the Museum of Art, founding the Grolier Club, inaugurating the new library, or getting up a new society of chamber music. His days were full, and they were filled decently. He supposed it was all a man ought to ask, something he knew he had missed, the flower of life. But he thought of it now as a thing so unattainable and improbable that to have repined would have been like despairing because one had not drawn the first prize in a lottery. There were 100 million tickets in his lottery, and there was only one prize. The chances had been too decidedly against him. When he thought of Ellen Olenska, it was abstractly, serenely, as one might think of some imaginary beloved in a book or a picture. She had become the composite vision of all that he had missed. That vision, faint and tenuous as it was, had kept him from thinking of other women. He had been what was called a faithful husband, and when May had suddenly died, carried off by the infectious pneumonia through which she had nursed their youngest child, he had honestly mourned her. Their long years together had shown him that it did not so much matter if marriage was a dull duty, as long as it kept the dignity of a duty. Lapsing from that, it became a mere battle of ugly appetites. Looking about him, he honored his own past and mourned for it. After all, there was good in the old ways. His eyes making the round of the room, done over by Dallas with English mezzotints, Chippendale cabinets, bits of chosen blue and white, and pleasantly shaded electric lamps, came back to the old East Lake writing table that he had never been willing to banish, and to his first photograph of May, which still kept its place beside his inkstand. There she was, tall, round-bosomed, and willowy, in her starched muslin and flapping leghorn, as he had seen her under the orange trees in the Mission Garden. And as he had seen her that day, so she had remained, never quite at the same height, yet never far below it, generous, faithful, unwearied, but so lacking in imagination, so incapable of growth, that the world of her youth had fallen into pieces and rebuilt itself without her ever being conscious of the change. This hard, bright blindness had kept her immediate horizon apparently unaltered. Her incapacity to recognize change made her children conceal their views from her as Archer concealed his. There had been from the first a joint pretense of sameness, a kind of innocent family hypocrisy in which father and children had unconsciously collaborated. And she had died thinking the world a good place, full of loving and harmonious households like her own, and resigned to leave it because she was convinced that, whatever happened, Newland would continue to inculcate in Dallas the same principles and prejudices which had shaped his parents' lives, and that Dallas, in turn, when Newland followed her, would transmit the sacred trust to little Bill. And of Mary she was sure as of her own self. So having snatched little Bill from the grave and given her life in the effort, she went contentedly to her place in the Archer vault in St. Mark's, where Mrs. Archer already lay safe from the terrifying trend which her daughter-in-law had never even become aware of. Opposite May's portrait stood one of her daughter. Mary Chivers was as tall and fair as her mother, but large-waisted, flat-chested, and slightly slouching, as the altered fashion required. Mary Chivers's mighty feats of athleticism could not have been performed with the 20-inch waist that May Archer's azure sash so easily spanned, and the difference seemed symbolic. The mother's life had been as closely girt as her figure. Mary, who was no less conventional and no more intelligent, yet led a larger life and held more tolerant views. There was good in the new order, too. The telephone clicked, and Archer, turning from the photographs, unhooked the transmitter at his elbow. How far they were from the days when the legs of the brass-button messenger boy had been New York's only means of quick communication. "Chicago wants you." It must be a long distance from Dallas, who had been sent to Chicago by his firm to talk over the plan of the lakeside palace they were to build for a young millionaire with ideas. The firm always sent Dallas on such errands. "Hello, Dad." "Yes, Dallas. I say, how do you feel about sailing on Wednesday?" "Mauritania." "Yes, next Wednesday, as ever is. Our client wants me to look at some Italian gardens before we settle anything, and has asked me to nip over on the next boat. I've got to be back on the 1st of June. The voice broke into a joyful, conscious laugh. "So we must look alive. I say, Dad, I want your help. Do come." Dallas seemed to be speaking in the room. The voice was as nearby and natural as if he had been lounging in his favorite armchair by the fire. The fact would not ordinarily have surprised Archer, for long-distance telephoning had become as much a matter of course as electric lighting and 5-day Atlantic voyages. But the laugh did startle him. It still seemed wonderful that across all those miles and miles of country, forest, river, mountain, prairie, roaring cities and busy indifferent millions, Dallas's laugh should be able to say, "Of course, whatever happens, I must get back on the 1st, because Fanny Beaufort and I are to be married on the 5th. The voice began again. "Think it over." "No, sir, not a minute. You've got to say yes now." "Why not, I'd like to know? If you can allege a single reason." "No, I knew it." "Then it's a go, eh? Because I count on you to ring up the Cunard office first thing tomorrow, and you'd better book a return on a boat from Marseille. I say, Dad, it'll be our last time together in this kind of way." "Oh, good, I knew you would." Chicago rang off, and Archer rose and began to pace up and down the room. It would be their last time together in this kind of way. The boy was right. They would have lots of other times after Dallas's marriage, his father was sure, for the two were born comrades, and Fanny Beaufort, whatever one might think of her, did not seem likely to interfere with their intimacy. On the contrary, from what he had seen of her, he thought she would be naturally included in it. Still, change was change, and differences were differences. And much as he felt himself drawn toward his future daughter-in-law, it was tempting to seize this last chance of being alone with his boy. There was no reason why he should not seize it, except the profound one that he had lost the habit of travel. May had disliked to move except for valid reasons, such as taking the children to the sea or in the mountains. She could imagine no other motive for leaving the house in 39th Street or their comfortable quarters at the Wellens in Newport. After Dallas had taken his degree, she had thought it her duty to travel for 6 months, and the whole family had made the old-fashioned tour through England, Switzerland, and Italy. Their time being limited, no one knew why, they had omitted France. Archer remembered Dallas's wrath at being asked to contemplate Mont Blanc instead of Reims and Chartres. But Mary and Bill wanted mountain climbing and had already yawned their way in Dallas's wake through the English cathedrals. And May, always fair to her children, had insisted on holding the balance evenly between their athletic and artistic proclivities. She had indeed proposed that her husband should go to Paris for a fortnight and join them on the Italian lakes after they had done Switzerland. But Archer had declined. "We'll stick together," he said, and May's face had brightened at his setting such a good example to Dallas. Since her death nearly 2 years before, there had been no reason for his continuing in the same routine. His children had urged him to travel. Mary Chivers had felt sure it would do him good to go abroad and see the galleries. The very mysteriousness of such a cure made her the more confident of its efficacy. But Archer had found himself held fast by habit, by memories, by a sudden, startled shrinking from new things. Now, as he reviewed his past, he saw into what a deep rut he had sunk. The worst of doing one's duty was that it apparently unfitted one for doing anything else. At least that was the view that the men of his generation had taken. The trenchant divisions between right and wrong, honest and dishonest, respectable and the reverse, had left so little scope for the unforeseen. There are moments when a man's imagination, so easily subdued to what it lives in, suddenly rises above its daily level and surveys the long windings of destiny. Archer hung there and wondered. What was left of the little world he had grown up in, and whose standards had bent and bound him? He remembered a sneering prophecy of poor Lawrence Lefferts, uttered years ago in that very room. "If things go on at this rate, our children will be marrying Beaufort's bastards." It was just what Archer's eldest son, the pride of his life, was doing, and nobody wondered or reproved. Even the boy's Aunt Janie, who still looked so exactly as she used to in her elderly youth, had taken her mother's emeralds and seed pearls out of their pink cotton wool and carried them with her own twitching hands to the future bride. And Fanny Beaufort, instead of looking disappointed at not receiving a set from a Paris jeweler, had exclaimed at their old-fashioned beauty and declared that when she wore them, she should feel like an Isabey miniature. Fanny Beaufort, who had appeared in New York at 18 after the death of her parents, had won its heart much as Madame Olenska had won it 30 years earlier. Only instead of being distrustful and afraid of her, society took her joyfully for granted. She was pretty, amusing, and accomplished. What more did anyone want? Nobody was narrow-minded enough to rake up against her the half-forgotten facts of her father's past and her own origin. Only the older people remembered so obscure an incident in the business life of New York as Beaufort's failure, or the fact that after his wife's death, he had been quietly married to the notorious Fanny Ring and had left the country with his new wife and a little girl who inherited her beauty. He was subsequently heard of in Constantinople, then in Russia, and a dozen years later, American travelers were handsomely entertained by him in Buenos Aires, where he represented a large insurance agency. He and his wife died there in the odor of prosperity, and one day their orphan daughter had appeared in New York in charge of May Archer's sister-in-law, Mrs. Jack Welland, whose husband had been appointed the girl's guardian. The fact threw her into almost cousinly relationship with Newland Archer's children, and nobody was surprised when Dallas's engagement was announced. Nothing could more dearly give the measure of the distance that the world had traveled. People nowadays were too busy with reforms and movements, with fads and fetishes and frivolities, to bother much about their neighbors. And of what account was anybody's past in the huge kaleidoscope where all the social atoms spun around on the same plane? Newland Archer, looking out of his hotel window at the stately gaiety of the Paris streets, felt his heart beating with the confusion and eagerness of youth. It was long since it had thus plunged and reared under his widening waistcoat, leaving him, the next minute, with an empty breast and hot temples. He wondered if it was thus that his son's conducted itself in the presence of Miss Fanny Beaufort, and decided that it was not. It functions as actively, no doubt, but the rhythm is different, he reflected, recalling the cool composure with which the young man had announced his engagement, and taken for granted that his family would approve. The difference is that these young people take it for granted that they're going to get whatever they want, and that we almost always took it for granted that we shouldn't. Only I wonder, the thing one's so certain of in advance, can it ever make one's heart beat as wildly? It was the day after their arrival in Paris, and the spring sunshine held Archer in his open window above the wide silvery prospect of the Place Vendôme. One of the things he had stipulated, almost the only one, when he had agreed to come abroad with Dallas, was that in Paris he shouldn't be made to go to one of the newfangled palaces. "Oh, all right, of course," Dallas good-naturedly agreed. "I'll take you to some jolly old-fashioned place, the Bristol, say," leaving his father speechless at hearing that the century-long home of kings and emperors was now spoken of as an old-fashioned inn, where one went for its quaint inconveniences and lingering local color. Archer had pictured often enough, in the first impatient years, the scene of his return to Paris. Then the personal vision had faded, and he had simply tried to see the city as the setting of Madame Olenska's life. Sitting alone at night in his library after the household had gone to bed, he had evoked the radiant outbreak of spring down the avenues of horse chestnuts, the flowers and statues in the public gardens, the whiff of lilacs from the flower carts, the majestic roll of the river under the great bridges, and the life of art and study and pleasure that filled each mighty artery to bursting. Now the spectacle was before him in its glory, and as he looked out on it, he felt shy, old-fashioned, inadequate, a mere gray speck of a man compared with the ruthless, magnificent fellow he had dreamed of being. Dallas's hand came down cheerily on his shoulder. "Hello, Father. This is something like, isn't it?" They stood for a while looking out in silence, and then the young man continued, "By the way, I've got a message for you. The Countess Olenska expects us both at 5:30. He said it lightly, carelessly, as he might have imparted any casual item of information, such as the hour at which their train was to leave for Florence the next evening. Archer looked at him and thought he saw in his gay young eyes a gleam of his great-grandmother Mingot's malice. "Oh, didn't I tell you?" Dallas pursued. "Fanny made me swear to do 3 things while I was in Paris. Get her the score of the last Debussy songs, go to the Grand Guignol, and see Madame Olenska. You know she was awfully good to Fanny when Mr. Beaufort sent her over from Buenos Aires to the Assumption. Fanny hadn't any friends in Paris, and Madame Olenska used to be kind to her and trot her about on holidays. I believe she was a great friend of the first Mrs. Beaufort's, and she's our cousin, of course. So I rang her up this morning, before I went out, and told her you and I were here for 2 days and wanted to see her." Archer continued to stare at him. "You told her I was here?" "Of course, why not?" Dallas's eyebrows went up whimsically. Then, getting no answer, he slipped his arm through his father's with a confidential pressure. "I say, Father, what was she like?" Archer felt his color rise under his son's unabashed gaze. "Come, own up. You and she were great pals, weren't you? Wasn't she most awfully lovely?" "Lovely? I don't know. She was different." "Ah, there you have it. That's what it always comes to, doesn't it? When she comes, she's different, and one doesn't know why. It's exactly what I feel about Fanny." His father drew back a step, releasing his arm. "About Fanny? But my dear fellow, I should hope so. Only I don't see—" "Dash it, Dad, don't be prehistoric. Wasn't she, once, your Fanny?" Dallas belonged body and soul to the new generation. He was the firstborn of Newland and May Archer, yet it had never been possible to inculcate in him even the rudiments of reserve. "What's the use of making mysteries? It only makes people want to nose 'em out," he always objected when enjoined to discretion. But Archer, meeting his eyes, saw the filial light under their banter. "My Fanny? Well, the woman you'd have chucked everything for? Only you didn't," continued his surprising son. "I didn't," echoed Archer with a kind of solemnity. "No, you date, you see, dear old boy. But Mother said—" "Your mother?" "Yes, the day before she died. It was when she sent for me alone. You remember? She said she knew we were safe with you, and always would be, because once, when she asked you to, you'd given up the thing you most wanted." Archer received this strange communication in silence. His eyes remained unseeingly fixed on the thronged sunlit square below the window. At length he said in a low voice, "She never asked me." "No, I forgot. You never did ask each other anything, did you? And you never told each other anything. You just sat and watched each other and guessed at what was going on underneath. A deaf and dumb asylum, in fact. Well, I back your generation for knowing more about each other's private thoughts than we ever have time to find out about our own. I say, Dad," Dallas broke off, "you're not angry with me? If you are, let's make it up and go and lunch at Henri's. I've got to rush out to Versailles afterward." Archer did not accompany his son to Versailles. He preferred to spend the afternoon in solitary roamings through Paris. He had to deal all at once with the packed regrets and stifled memories of an inarticulate lifetime. After a little while, he did not regret Dallas's indiscretion. It seemed to take an iron band from his heart to know that after all, someone had guessed and pitied, and that it should have been his wife moved him indescribably. Dallas, for all his affectionate insight, would not have understood that. To the boy, no doubt, the episode was only a pathetic instance of vain frustration, of wasted forces. But was it really no more? For a long time, Archer sat on a bench in the Champs-Élysées and wondered while the stream of life rolled by. A few streets away, a few hours away, Ellen Olenska waited. She had never gone back to her husband, and when he had died some years before, she had made no change in her way of living. There was nothing now to keep her and Archer apart, and that afternoon he was to see her. He got up and walked across the Place de la Concorde and the Tuileries Gardens to the Louvre. She had once told him that she often went there, and he had a fancy to spend the intervening time in a place where he could think of her as perhaps having lately been. For an hour or more he wandered from gallery to gallery through the dazzle of afternoon light, and one by one the pictures burst on him in their half-forgotten splendor, filling his soul with the long echoes of beauty. After all, his life had been too starved. Suddenly, before an effulgent Titian, he found himself saying, "But I'm only 57. And then he turned away. For such summer dreams it was too late, but surely not for a quiet harvest of friendship, of comradeship, in the blessed hush of her nearness. He went back to the hotel where he and Dallas were to meet, and together they walked again across the Place de la Concorde and over the bridge that leads to the Chamber of Deputies. Dallas, unconscious of what was going on in his father's mind, was talking excitedly and abundantly of Versailles. He had had but one previous glimpse of it, during a holiday trip in which he had tried to pack all the sights he had been deprived of when he had had to go with the family to Switzerland, and tumultuous enthusiasm and cocksure criticism tripped each other up on his lips. As Archer listened, his sense of inadequacy and inexpressiveness increased. The boy was not insensitive, he knew, but he had the facility and self-confidence that came of looking at fate not as a master, but as an equal. That's it. They feel equal to things. They know their way about, he mused, thinking of his son as the spokesman of the new generation, which had swept away all the old landmarks, and with them the signposts and the danger signal. Suddenly Dallas stopped short, grasping his father's arm. "Oh, by Jove!" he exclaimed. They had come out into the great tree-planted space before the Invalides. The dome of Mansart floated ethereally above the budding trees and the long gray front of the building, drawing up into itself all the rays of afternoon light. It hung there like the visible symbol of the race's glory. Archer knew that Madame Olenska lived in a square near one of the avenues radiating from the Invalides, and he had pictured the quarter as quiet and almost obscure, forgetting the central splendor that lit it up. Now, by some queer process of association, that golden light became for him the pervading illumination in which she lived. For nearly 30 years, her life, of which he knew so strangely little, had been spent in this rich atmosphere that he already felt to be too dense and yet too stimulating for his lungs. He thought of the theaters she must have been to, the pictures she must have looked at, the sober and splendid old houses she must have frequented, the people she must have talked with, the incessant stir of ideas, curiosities, images, and associations thrown out by an intensely social race in a setting of immemorial manners. And suddenly he remembered the young Frenchman who had once said to him, "Ah, good conversation. There is nothing like it, is there?" Archer had not seen Monsieur Riviere, or heard of him, for nearly 30 years, and that fact gave the measure of his ignorance of Madame Olenska's existence. More than half a lifetime divided them, and she had spent the long interval among people he did not know, in a society he but faintly guessed at, in conditions he would never wholly understand. During that time he had been living with his youthful memory of her, but she had doubtless had other and more tangible companionship. Perhaps she too had kept her memory of him as something apart. But if she had, it must have been like a relic in a small dim chapel, where there was not time to pray every day. They had crossed the Place des Invalides and were walking down one of the thoroughfares flanking the building. It was a quiet quarter, after all, in spite of its splendor and its history, and the fact gave one an idea of the riches Paris had to draw on, since such scenes as this were left to the few and the indifferent. The day was fading into a soft, sunshot haze, pricked here and there by a yellow electric light, and passers were rare in the little square into which they had turned. Dallas stopped again and looked up. "It must be here," he said, slipping his arm through his father's with a movement from which Archer's shyness did not shrink, and they stood together looking up at the house. It was a modern building, without distinctive character, but many-windowed and pleasantly balconied up its wide cream-colored front. On one of the upper balconies, which hung well above the rounded tops of the horse chestnuts in the square, the awnings were still lowered, as though the sun had just left it. "I wonder which floor," Dallas conjectured, and moving toward the porte-cochere, he put his head into the porter's lodge and came back to say, "The 5th. It must be the one with the awnings." Archer remained motionless, gazing at the upper windows as if the end of their pilgrimage had been attained. "I say, you know, it's nearly 6, his son at length reminded him. The father glanced away at an empty bench under the trees. "I believe I'll sit there a moment," he said. "Why, aren't you well?" his son exclaimed. "Oh, perfectly. But I should like you, please, to go up without me." Dallas paused before him, visibly bewildered. "But I say, Dad, do you mean you won't come up at all?" "I don't know," said Archer slowly. "If you don't, she won't understand." "Go, my boy, perhaps I shall follow you." Dallas gave him a long look through the twilight. "But what on earth shall I say?" "My dear fellow, don't you always know what to say?" his father rejoined with a smile. "Very well. I shall say you're old-fashioned and prefer walking up the 5 flights because you don't like lifts." His father smiled again. "Say I'm old-fashioned. That's enough." Dallas looked at him again, and then, with an incredulous gesture, passed out of sight under the vaulted doorway. Archer sat down on the bench and continued to gaze at the awning balcony. He calculated the time it would take his son to be carried up in the lift to the 5th floor, to ring the bell and be admitted to the hall, and then ushered into the drawing room. He pictured Dallas entering that room with his quick, assured step and his delightful smile, and wondered if the people were right who said that his boy took after him. Then he tried to see the persons already in the room, for probably at that sociable hour there would be more than one, and among them a dark lady, pale and dark, who would look up quickly, half rise, and hold out a long, thin hand with 3 rings on it. He thought she would be sitting in a sofa corner near the fire, with azaleas banked behind her on a table. "It's more real to me here than if I went up," he suddenly heard himself say, and the fear lest that last shadow of reality should lose its edge kept him rooted to his seat as the minutes succeeded each other. He sat for a long time on the bench in the thickening dusk, his eyes never turning from the balcony. At length a light shone through the windows, and a moment later a manservant came out on the balcony, drew up the awnings, and closed the shutters. At that, as if it had been the signal he waited for, Newland Archer got up slowly and walked back alone to his hotel.